They thought a whip could break her. They thought hunger, chains, and silence could bury her soul. But in the sweltering summer of Georgia, 1852, one enslaved girl decided the only way to live was to kill. The night pressed down heavy on the plantation. Cicadas sang their endless dirge, and the magnolia trees released their sickly sweet perfume, covering the scent of sweat, blood, and iron that stained the earth. The big house glimmered with candlelight, its tall white columns glowing like false angels. To the masters it was a monument of wealth. To the enslaved, it was a tomb where screams were swallowed by the walls. Inside, a feast waited. Silver spoons gleamed. Roasted meat smoked in the air. Laughter from the plantation family rose over the table, each chuckle sharp as a knife. But what they didn't know, what they could not imagine, was that every bite before them carried the taste of death. In the corner, she stood, thin, silent, her eyes lowered in practiced obedience. A girl who had been forced to serve, to scrub, to bow, to endure. They had beaten her, starved her, treated her body as property. They believed her too broken to resist. They believed her silence meant submission. They were wrong. Her silence was the silence of a snake coiled in the grass, waiting, watching, ready to strike. The knowledge had been passed down in whispers, carried from Africa across the salt-bloated ships, kept alive in the cabins where chains rattled at night. Knowledge of roots that blister the tongue, leaves that choke the breath, powders that turn a body into a corpse before morning. And in the kitchen's firelight, she had mixed that knowledge with her rage. Tonight, the plantation's laughter would rot into screams. But to understand the horror of this final supper, you must first walk with her through the red clay fields where backs split under the whip. You must hear the cries that echoed in the night, cut short by boots and blood. You must see the girl, not as nameless history would dismiss her, but as a living storm, shaping her revenge one silent breath at a time. The tale that survives is not clean. Some say she poisoned them all, watching each master fall face first into the feast they believed they deserved. Others claim she slipped away into the swamps, her name never spoken again. Some whisper she was caught, dragged out in chains, her body made into a warning. And then there are those who say she became something else entirely, a spirit of vengeance, forever bound to the Georgia soil, still stalking the plantations that rise and rot under the southern sun. What we know for certain is this. On one night in 1852, the illusion of power was shattered by a girl who refused to bow. She turned their table into their coffin, their supper into their grave, and once the candles burned down, the big house would never be silent again. The plantation stretched outward like a wound across the Georgia soil. By daylight, it shimmered with endless rows of cotton, white against red clay as if snow had fallen on blood. But to those forced to tend it, there was no beauty, only blistered fingers, bent spines, and the hiss of the overseer's whip cutting through the air. At dawn, the cabins stirred. Smoke rose from chimneys of mud and timber, carrying the scent of boiled cornmeal and bitter coffee substitutes. Children cried softly. Men shuffled out, their bodies bent from years of breaking under the sun, and women moved silently, their eyes lowered, their hands already busy with work that would never end. The girl rose with them. She was young, no more than 16, maybe 17, but her body carried the marks of years stolen. Her wrists bore faint scars from rope burns. Her back ached as if she had already lived a lifetime. She moved lightly, deliberately, with the kind of silence that came not from shyness but from survival. To the others, she was known only by a name given by her owners, a name spoken harshly, like an order. Her true name, the one her mother had whispered into her ear as an infant, was gone, stolen by the auction block years ago. But inside her mind she clung to fragments, the sound of her mother's voice, the lullabies that had floated through the dark of the cabins, the soft words in a language the masters never understood. By day, she worked in the kitchen of the big house. There, the air was thick with heat from the hearth, filled with the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread, meals she rarely tasted herself. She carried trays, polished silver, scrubbed stains from linens. Every step she took was watched. Every mistake earned punishment. The family saw her as part of the scenery, no different from the table she set or the floor she scrubbed. To them she was invisible. Yet invisibility had its power. They did not see her eyes when they mocked her. They did not notice her ears when they plotted and schemed over dinner. They did not sense the way her silence was shifting, no longer just submission, but something sharper, darker. Her presence was small but not fragile. She had a quiet strength, the kind that grows in shadows. Her eyes lingered on the tiniest details. the way the master's hand shook when he drank too much, the sharp tongue of the mistress when her pride was pricked, the spoiled laughter of their children as they mocked those who bent before them. She saw all of it. She remembered all of it, and behind her silence her emotions burned, anger that never had a voice, grief that was never given space to breathe, fear that curdled into something harder, heavier. Each day she swallowed it down with the same practice she used when swallowing scraps of leftover food, carefully, without showing a trace. The kitchen became her prison, and her stage. Pots hung overhead like iron bells. Knives glinted in the firelight. Jars of spices lined the shelves, their colors bright and innocent. But she had learned that not everything was what it seemed. Among the herbs for flavor, there were herbs for pain. Among the powders for taste, powders for death. She knew their whispers. She had watched older women murmur over leaves and roots, using them to treat fevers, to ease childbirth, to curse enemies when no other power was left. At night, when she returned to the cabin, the others sometimes caught her staring into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. They thought it was sorrow. They thought it was despair. But she was listening, to the crackle of the flames, to the rhythm of her own heart, to the quiet voice that had begun to rise inside her. The girl had learned the rules of survival. Speak little, obey quickly, endure silently. But she also learned something else, something the masters never suspected. She learned that silence can sharpen itself into a blade, that waiting can be a weapon, that a girl they thought was broken could be the one to break them. From the outside, nothing about her day betrayed what lived in her mind. She scrubbed, she served, she bowed. But her eyes told another story. When she looked at the family across the dinner table, she no longer saw them as untouchable gods. She saw them as flesh, as fragile, breakable bodies. And when she watched their mouths open wide in laughter, teeth flashing over plates of food, she imagined them choking. She imagined the laughter cutting short, turning to coughing, to shrieks, to silence. It was only imagination for now. But in the humid air of Georgia, imagination could fester. And in the silence of the enslaved girl's heart, a plan had begun to take shape. The breaking point came on a day heavy with heat, when the sky pressed down like an iron lid and the air itself seemed to burn. The girl had been in the kitchen since dawn, scrubbing the blackened bottoms of pots, her fingers raw from lye soap. The masters were restless, their tempers sharp with the weather. The mistress snapped orders like the crack of a pistol, her voice echoing through the halls. Outside, the overseer's bark carried across the fields, a sound that made even the cicadas fall quiet. Then came the scream. It cut across the plantation like a blade, high and jagged, followed by the unmistakable sound of leather splitting flesh. The girl froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She knew that sound. Everyone did. She slipped from the kitchen doorway and into the yard, her bare feet soundless on the packed earth. Out by the whipping post, under the unpitying sun, a boy no older than 13 was bound, his shirt stripped away, his back a canvas of blood. The overseer stood behind him, arms swinging again and again, each lash carving red rivers into the boy's skin. The master watched from a shaded chair, sipping from a silver cup, his expression calm, almost bored. The mistress stood nearby, fanning herself, her lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The girl's stomach twisted. The boy's cries were raw, choking. With every strike, dust rose in clouds around his feet, mixing with the blood that dripped down his legs. The overseer's whip cracked like thunder, and with each crack the girl felt something inside her splinter. She wanted to look away. She couldn't. The boy's eyes rolled back, his knees buckling, but the ropes held him upright. His voice broke into a whimper that barely carried across the yard. The master said something she couldn't hear, something that made the mistress laugh. The overseer drew back the whip again, his arm glistening with sweat, and brought it down in a strike that made the girl flinch as though it had landed on her own back. Silence followed. The boy sagged forward, his body motionless. For a moment the only sounds were the buzzing of flies, the distant rustle of cotton in the fields, and the heavy breathing of the overseer. Then casually, the master rose from his chair. "That will do," he said, as if ending a performance. The boy was cut down and dragged across the dirt like a broken sack. The girl felt her vision blur. Heat shimmered before her eyes, but it was not just the sun. It was rage, thick and consuming, rising in her chest until she thought she might choke on it. No one looked at her. No one cared that she stood there watching. To them she was invisible, just another shadow. But inside that shadow something changed. She saw the master's hand, fat with rings, lifting his silver cup. She saw the mistress's pale fingers, resting lightly on her fan, her laughter still hanging in the air. She saw the overseer's whip, coiled like a snake at his side, and she imagined them bound. She imagined them screaming. She imagined them broken. The thought struck her like lightning, terrifying and thrilling all at once. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, the silence inside her wasn't just survival. It wasn't just endurance. It was a seed of vengeance buried deep, watered by blood. She turned back to the kitchen, her steps steady though her hands trembled. The pot still waited, the fire still crackled, the food still simmered. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. When she stirred the pot, she no longer saw stew. She saw poison. When she laid the table, she no longer saw a feast. She saw a trap. That night, as she lay on the hard floor of the cabin, she closed her eyes and saw the boy's broken body again. She heard the laughter. She smelled the iron tang of blood in the dust. And then slowly her mind shifted. She no longer saw the boy suffering. She saw the family choking on their own breath. She saw their eyes bulging, their hands clawing at the air. She saw their laughter twist into screams. The rage inside her had found its purpose. The breaking point had come, and there would be no turning back. Night became the girl's confidant. When the household calmed and the lanterns guttered to small moons, she moved like a shadow with a purpose. She learned the language of hush. Old women in the cabins spoke in it, soft syllables between coughs, stories folded into commands. They pointed out roots that tasted like sorrow, leaves that curled like a closed fist, powders that the masters pretended were only for mending cuts. They taught her to listen to the land, which banks held bitter things, which marsh edges hid, bitter-sweet leaves where salt and iron pooled in the earth. They did not give measurements or recipes. They gave stories, warnings, and a map of small, secret places. From those fragments she pieced together an intention. Her preparations were a ritual of theft and concealment. At midday she worked with the clatter and steam of the kitchen, hands busy, eyes watching. At dusk she walked the fields as if to fetch water or check a coal's ember, while her fingers brushed away from sight a scrap of something taken, a twig wrapped in cloth, a bulk of dried leaf folded into her apron, a small pouch, soft as a moth, hidden beneath cabbage in the larder until night swallowed scent and sight. Every theft felt like courting discovery. Once a child from the house snatched a ribbon from her basket and ran laughing past the pantry door. She let him go, felt the blood press at the back of her throat, and tucked her hands into her sleeves until the laughter faded. Another night she stacked plates so a visiting aunt's tray would brush against the jar where she'd tucked a folded leaf. The jar clinked faintly, and she froze, listening to the conversation in the dining room until the clink was swallowed by the master's booming voice. A breath she did not know she had held escaped in a small, silent hiss. Her work changed subtly. She handled spices with a new reverence, as if each powdered shelf were a co-conspirator. Salt was no longer merely salt. It was a distractor she scattered on a platter to mask the trace of anything else. She learned how to place a bowl where a child's elbow would nudge it, how to time the clearing of plates so no one would look twice. She began to think in the small rhythms of the household, the exact cadence of the mistress's laughter, the moment the master set his napkin aside to signal the end of toasts, the thin window between dessert and the family's predictable, slurred pride. Her nights were long. By the hearth she sat and ground things, not for instruction but for the sound of work under her hands, for the way the grinding soothed the trembling in her fingers. She kept the mixture in a small pouch tied with a scrap of faded blue cloth, the color of the sky outside the cabin at dawn, because color was less suspicious than steel or glass. Sometimes she would press a pinch to her tongue and taste only bitterness. Sometimes she would press the pouch to her chest and feel the drum of her heart like a secret drumbeat for the plan. Whispers moved through the cabins, brittle as dried corn husks. Be careful, you'll be seen. It will end badly. Some voices curled around her like smoke, trying to smother her resolve. Others pressed up like warm hands against cold places, saying, if they will not be moved by prayer, then they will be moved by what they have fed us. An older woman, stooped, the map of a hard life in the lines of her face, took her hand once in the dark and said nothing at all. The silence was permission. Fear was a constant companion, and yet it did not feel like fear. It felt like sharpening. Every small, near miss edged her closer to a point she could not unsee. One late night, the mistress entered the pantry with the mistress's visiting cousin, and their talk brushed the shelf where she'd hidden her cloth. The cousin reached, fingers hovering, then changed his mind and took a jar of preserves instead. The girl stood behind the swinging kitchen door, palms slick with sweat, and imagined what would happen if that jar had been her hidden pouch. The image of fingers finding cloth and lifting it filled her like frost. There were other dangers not born of the house. Men on the road, traders, strangers, stumbled near the cabins and asked too many questions, their eyes hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. She learned to smile and hunch her shoulders away from them, to let their curiosity drift past like wind through a screen. The plantation world had many eyes. She learned where each one looked and where its blind spots lay. She began to rehearse the moment in her head as if it were a play, each movement measured by memory rather than instruction. She pictured the table set, the family gathered, the master's hand reaching for a fork. But she never pictured the method clearly. The plan was always a feeling, the hush before a bell, the folding of hands, the suddenness of a storm. That vagueness was deliberate. A real how-to would be a real how-to, and she refused to hold anything that could be translated into instruction. Her revenge would be a story, not a lesson. Small rituals kept her steady. Before the night she chose, she walked to the edge of the woods and pressed her forehead to a tree, listening to the dark. She whispered names that had been taken from her mothers and aunts, calling them into the earth as if laying offerings. She wrapped a cloth around her hair the way the older women did, and braided in a strand of river-worn grass, an unspoken sign that she belonged to a line that had survived worse. Each action was a hinge. Each hinge swung her further from the slave she had been and closer to the agent she intended to become. The house itself conspired with her. There were seasons when the mistress's temper made the household careless. There were nights when the master's indulgence with spirits led to doors left ajar and servants' feet uncounted. She learned to watch the calendar of their indulgences. She learned which holidays brought guests with loud voices that would drown a scuffle, and which meals would draw every relative to the table. She learned the rhythm of lull within their arrogance. Near discoveries multiplied, and each almost was a tiny story in itself. A spoon clattered beneath the table where her hand had rested. A bowl was left in the washroom, the lid slightly ajar. Footsteps, too many, approached the kitchen at the precise moment her back was turned. Twice she felt the cold brush of a glance that almost sought her in the room, and twice she turned toward something else, a dropped napkin, a child's scraped knee, so quick the glance slid away like a moth. Every close call tightened the weave of the plan, made it more careful, more cunning. Each cliffhanger added weight to the quiet. The girl no longer moved through the household by habit. She moved by intent, an intent that hummed under her skin like a wire ready to snap. By the time she finally set her hands to the last preparations, she was no longer the trembling girl who had first listened to the old women. She was composed, a figure whose silence had been forged into resolve. The plan had become less a thought and more a ceremony. Hidden steps, timed breaths, and a single night where the house's hunger would be turned inward. She walked the path back to the cabin one pre-dawn hour, her pouch pressed under her apron, every sense awake. Crickets paused at intervals, as if listening. The sky threaded pale between the trees. At the cabin door she paused and turned one. Last time, looking up at the white columns that seemed to pierce the sky. Behind those columns people slept, believing the night protected them. She let the thought burn, let it become tinder. Then she slipped inside and began to prepare. The night was set like a stage. The big house hummed with the small arrogance of ritual. The family primped and preened. Candles were trimmed to a soft, flattering light, and the china was polished until faces blurred in its gleam. Guests arrived in carriages that sighed on the drive, laughing into collars and smelling of wine. The house filled with the sound of voices that believed themselves safe. She moved within that sound like a shadow rehearsed. Plates slid in warm hands. Napkins were adjusted with a gentleman's care. The girl placed the bowls in the platters, her movements deliberate and precise, as if every gesture were an oath. No one looked at her. They only looked through her, past the maid, past the window into the world they owned. They did not see the way her fingers trembled the instant she turned away, or the way her jaw tightened until the ache in her temples was a prayer. Dinner began with the usual toasts. Glasses chimed and laughter lifted, bright and careless. The master rose and declaimed a crude joke about order and legacy. The guests laughed, their eyes shining with the reflection of plate and coin. The mistress presided over the table like a small empress, smoothing her skirts, fanning away any hint of discomfort. Children at the end of the table poked at silverware and mimicked the adults' laughter. their mouths full of the lavishness they believed was their birthright. The first change was almost imperceptible. A cough thin as a reed escaped the master's throat. Someone glanced over, amused, and then went back to their conversation. A hand reached for bread. A fork clinked against a plate. The master swallowed and smiled as if nothing lay in his chest but pride. Then the master's face tightened. His jaw worked. He shifted in his chair. A hand flew to his throat and then clutched his napkin as if to hide the tremor. The laughter at the other end of the table faltered into a puzzled silence. The mistress blinked, then frowned. "Are you well?" she asked, her voice bright at the edges with irritation. The master tried to laugh, a thin sound that didn't hold. His skin flushed, then paled. He reached for his glass and found his fingers unsteady. His hand knocked the rim. Wine slashed across the tablecloth in a dark arc. Panic unfolded with the terrible slowness of a thunderhead approaching. The mistress's polite alarm curdled into terror when the master doubled over, clutching at his chest. Guests stood, plates scraping. A chair toppled, and a child began to cry. Soon it was not just the master. The cousin at the other end of the table clutched his stomach, rising to his feet, and then sinking back, eyes wide and full of disbelief. The overseer, who had swaggered in to boast about the day's work, grew pale as his breath shortened and his broad shoulders began to convulse. The hostess's laugh cracked into a strangled sound. Someone vomited, retching into a napkin and then gagging, their face draining of color as if the blood itself had been pulled away. The room turned fast and vertiginous. Glasses fell from trembling hands and shattered like small moons. Candles guttered, their flames extinguished by hands that shook too wildly to protect them. The air filled with a new sound, the raw animality of people in the immediate terror of their own bodies failing. Gasps, coughs, the wet sound of someone collapsing onto floorboards. The polished silver flashed in the candlelight for the last time, and then it lay dull under the weight of hands that no longer moved. She watched. She did not gloat. Her face remained small and unreadable in the doorway. The noise in her head was not triumphant. It was the slow, stunned drum of grief and release. Each fall was a punctuation mark in a sentence she had not been allowed to finish. The laughter that had once been a blade now choked on its own echo. Near the table, the mistress clawed at her throat, wild-eyed and improbably furious. She thrashed, sending a chair skidding, smearing wine and the last pulses of meal across the floor. Her hand found the silver candlestick and brought it down, once, twice, as if the world were something she could beat into sense. The cousin's chest heaved, his face contorted with the sudden wreck of his insides. The overseer toppled like a tree, his body folding in on itself. Hard as a closed book, people called out, "Help, call the doctor, fetch water." But those words were thin in the room that had become a small, collapsing universe. A guest tried to carry the mistress toward the garden, but her limbs refused. The child at the far end of the table crawled under a chair and began to whimper, small shoulders shuddering with sobs that had no rhythm to them. Amid that chaos, the girl felt an unearthly calm. Her heartbeat slowed, and with the slow cadence of a tide she had only ever worshipped in memory, she let the moment take its course. She had not wanted spectacle. She had wanted the end of spectacle. She had not wanted to see the thrash and the slur just for the sake of cruelty. Her aim had been to invert a system, to take the dinner, the emblem of their consumption and her own denial, and turn it toward those who had turned her into a thing. She moved when the room began to thin. When the overwhelming of the senses made attention a dangerous thing, she stepped between the overturned chair and the fallen silverware, stooped to scoop a child's small hand from a puddle of spilled stew, and set it upon a clean piece of cloth. Her touch was soft, startling, and the child looked up bewildered. For a moment, the girl's face softened in a way that had nothing to do with triumph. There was pity there, edged with something like mercy. Outside, the sky remained indifferent. Stars blinked as if nothing had happened. A dog barked in the distance. The plantation was not yet awakened by the cries that would ripple through its cabins and fields. That would come later, with the morning and the bodies hauled and sorted into meanings. Two sounds remained in the big house after most others had fallen quiet. The ragged breathing from rooms where people clung to staggered life, and the trembling footsteps of those who had not been felled, moving like ghosts through the wreckage of their pride. A neighbor who had been at the feast staggered into the hall, eyes wide and streaming, and whispered of curses and witches, invoking what he did not understand to cover what he could never face, the fragile mortality of those who had thought themselves immortal. She slipped away while they were still muttering. No one sought her. No one thought to look in the cabins for the hand that set the table. To them, the invisible remained invisible until it was convenient to notice. As she reached the shadowed side of the house, she paused and looked back once. The candles burned down to stubs. A woman's muffled sob echoed through the corridor. The tablecloth was a red and white smear of wine and ruin. The girl allowed herself one very small thing, a breath that tasted like salt and coal, and something dangerously like relief. The relief did not roar. It was a quiet, modest thing beneath the ribs, and it was accompanied by a hollowness like an echo. The girl knew that the action she had set in motion could not be undone. She had crossed from one existence to another. The line had been drawn by the sound of breaking china and the unmistakable hush that follows a scream. She had intended to destroy the myth of their invulnerability. She had succeeded, but success did not bring celebration. Only a long, thin exhale, and the knowledge that the world would now respond differently. Men with badges or ropes would come. The overseer's family would demand answers. The plantation's order would attempt to stitch itself back together with new cruelty, new rules, new warnings. The girl, who had been for so long a subject of their dominion, had become the kind of story that divides before and after. She melted into the night, a small shape among larger shadows. Behind her, the big house, white and obstinate, shivered as the first of the servants stumbled out to see what horror had unfolded. Lantern light moved like worried insects, and voices began to carry across the yard, jagged and unsure. She did not look back again. The sound of their collapse followed her like a drum. It would accompany her in the days to come, in the faces she would never allow herself to forget. But in that moment, with the night swallowing her figure, she felt nothing but the strange, precise calm of someone who had lit a match and watched a long-burning lie consume itself. The stage had been struck. The curtain had fallen. The house would never be the same. Dawn did not rush in as it usually did. It crept uncertain and bruised through the plantation's shutters, washing the big house in a thin, reluctant light. The yard smelled of iron and overturned clay. Lanterns bobbed like stunned fireflies as servants and neighbors moved through the wreckage, eyes wide, mouths open to shapes of the unthinkable. Where the table had been, there was a landscape of ruined silver and upturned chairs, a ruin that tasted like pride and coin. They worked at first with the mechanical speed of people who have rehearsed grief, dragging bodies into rooms, covering faces with coarse linen, arguing in low voices about who would fetch the doctor. Hands that had never touched a broom in their lives swept at the carpet, as if sweeping could erase what had happened. The mistress, wrapped in a shawl that did nothing to soften the hardness in her expression, moved like one in a waking nightmare, fingers clotted with wine and terror. Her scream, when it came, was not for the dead but for the idea that there could be eyes that looked upon them and saw beyond the facade. News flowed outward like oil slipping over water. Men at neighboring farms stood at their fences and watched, their faces careful and thin. Whispers thickened into verdicts. A curse, some said. Witchcraft. Others hissed the old word. An accusation of witchcraft always easier than asking how a table full of men had been felled while the world watched. Rumor fed rumor. Names were assigned, altered, then forgotten, as is the way with stories that must be made tidy. In the cabins, the reaction was quieter but sharper. People moved like animals who had smelled smoke, alert, small, and instinctive. Some wept openly, some hardened. The old woman who had once touched the girl's hand sat by the fire and hummed a thin, hollow tune that carried no accusation and no comfort. Children held closer to their mothers. Men looked to the woods with a sudden, cautious attention, as though the trees might keep secrets better than the house ever could. As for the girl, she vanished the way certain storms do, sudden and final. She walked out through a side passage while the household still staggered beneath the first shock, slipping past linen and overturned trays, past the shapes of men who would later swear they had not seen her. She did not flee with the clumsy panic of someone running from punishment. She moved with the calm of one who had finished a thing, and now was stepping back to let its consequences unfold. Her pouch was gone from under her apron. Her hands smelled faintly of broth, and something darker that the morning could not name. Her path took her to the edge of the property where the cotton met the scrubby tree line. She paused there and listened. The plantation sounds were starting to gather again. The low murmur of those who would make lists, the barked orders of men sent to find answers, the careful calculations of property and reparations. She let those noises wash over her and then turned away. She did not look back. The aftermath shaped itself into two kinds of survival. For the family, survival meant reasserting power, blaming, punishing, and reminding those who remained of their place. Men were called in from the county. The masters stitched explanations from fear and arrogance. An ill-prepared feast, a tainted supply, bad luck, anything but culpability. For the enslaved, survival meant a quieter, daily negotiation. They watched each other's faces more closely now. Doors were bolted earlier. Steps were counted in the dark. Stories were hushed into thin, careful whispers that traveled like contraband. There were punishments, as cruelty always bends itself toward order. Those who were accused, those the family could name or the neighbors suspected, were questioned in ways that left echoes in the bones. A few were taken away, their fates sealed in the silence of official records and the louder, angrier claims made in private. The plantation's regime, shaken, attempted to stitch itself back together with sharper rules, and a new cruelty meant to reassure the people sitting naked before its authority. And yet, something had been broken that no new lash could mend. The arrogance that had passed as certainty now bore cracks. The children of the household who had once practiced mockery now watched the faces of the enslaved with a different kind of attention, equal parts fear and curiosity. The crew who once obeyed without question began to move with more eyes open than closed. In the quiet pockets between those daily shifts, a legend began to form. Around smoky hearths, women told the story in broken, dangerous fragments. The girl who had turned a supper into ruin was spoken of with a mixture of awe, fear, and something like gratitude. She was a name people did not say aloud in front of the master's kin. She was also a story offered in the dark to children who needed to understand that power could be made to bend. As for the girl herself, the accounts splintered. Some swore she had crossed state lines and disappeared into swamps where no master would follow. Others believed she had been found and broken as a lesson, the memory of her body buried beyond counting. A few insisted, in that particular way communities do when they are learning to protect a fragile truth, that she had become something mythic, almost not a person anymore, but a force that collected itself around empty chairs and the scent of magnolia after rain. What remained unambiguous was the change. The plantation's appetite for unquestioned dominance had been interrupted, however briefly, by a single deliberate act. That night became a line in the soil, before and after, for those who lived there. For some, it meant retribution. For others, a small breath of impossible hope. The house, however, bore its wounds differently. It tried to whitewash them. It scrubbed, it repaired, it invented a narrative that would let it sleep. But when the lanterns were put out and the corridors filled with shadows, the silence there was no longer the obedient hush it had once been. It trembled with the memory of a table that once sang with laughter and then stopped, mid-note. They say some stories are not told but carried, passed from mouth to mouth like a spark that refuses to die, hidden in whispers so soft they could be mistaken for the wind. Hers was one of them. The plantation never recovered its old rhythm. Tried, of course, cotton was still planted, overseers still barked, children still recited prayers before they ate. But the echo of that night, the feast turned funeral, hung in every corner like smoke that no hand could wave away. Servants who set the table afterward avoided the head of it, their eyes lowering in quick, nervous glances. Guests who once arrived in fine carriages now made excuses, whispering of illness or business that could not wait. The master's name, once heavy with arrogance, became a curse on local tongues. Neighbors muttered about the poisoned supper, their stories bending and changing with each retelling. Some swore it had been a sickness, a plague in the food. Others said the devil himself had walked through the kitchen and poured shadow into the stew. But in the cabins where truth lived more carefully, the story had sharper edges. There, by the faint light of embers, her name was spoken with reverence and warning. Mothers would hush their children and say, "Do not forget, one of us made them fall. One of us took their laughter and turned it into screams." To the elders, she was no longer a girl but a spirit of vengeance, proof that even silence could sharpen itself into a blade. The legend grew with time. They said she had vanished into the swamp, where her reflection lived in waters dark as ink, waiting for the day she would rise again. Others believed she had slipped north with the Underground Railroad, her face lost to freedom, but her story left behind like a candle that refused to gut her out. Still others whispered that she never left at all, that her ghost lingered at the plantation's edge, watching, waiting, listening for the sound of chains. Those who worked the fields after her disappearance claimed to hear her steps at night, soft as breath, moving between cabins. Sometimes when the moon was high, the wind carried a sound like a pot being stirred, steady, deliberate, the rhythm of a hand mixing fate into broth. Dogs would whine and refuse to cross certain thresholds. Overseers, hardened men who scoffed at superstition, found themselves looking over their shoulders when the cicadas fell silent all at once. In town, the tale transformed into cautionary lore. Beware the poisoned maid, parents told their children. Do not mistreat the hands that feed you. Her story became a parable whispered over graves and in fields, where sweat mixed with soil, a secret anthem of defiance dressed in the robes of myth, but myth has its own hunger. With every telling, she became less of a girl and more of a force. Some said her eyes glowed like coals when she vanished into the woods. Others swore her hands were always wet, dripping with the remnants of what she had stirred. There were those who believed the very air in the dining room turned colder on the anniversary of that night, as if the house remembered her better than the living did. What the truth was, no one could say. Perhaps she found freedom in another land. Perhaps she was swallowed by the very silence she had once wielded. Perhaps she still walks among us, nameless, unrecognized, her story hidden behind another's eyes. What could not be denied was this: her act had carved itself into memory, deeper than scars. She had broken the illusion that power was untouchable. She had proven that even the smallest hands forced into obedience, hands stripped of dignity, could reach across the table and turn the feast into reckoning. And so, her name slipped from history into folklore, and from folklore into something darker, heavier, more enduring. Not every plantation bore her mark, but every plantation feared it. Masters raised their cups more cautiously. Mistresses eyed their kitchens with suspicion, and deep in the cabins, children pressed their faces into their mothers' skirts and asked in a whisper, "Is she still out there?" The mothers did not answer. They only looked to the trees, where the night gathered itself, thick and silent. Some say that if you pass through Georgia when the air is heavy and the cicadas suddenly fall quiet, you might feel her watching. The rustle of leaves will sound like skirts brushing past. The taste of iron will rise in your throat, unbidden. And in that instant, you will know the truth that her masters learned too late. The enslaved girl who poured death into the bowls of her oppressors never truly disappeared. She became the silence itself. If her story left you unsettled, if you felt the silence press against your chest as she slipped into legend, then don't let it vanish into the dark. Share this tale, so her ghost walks further. And if you want more stories where history bleeds into horror, where whispers grow into vengeance, then stay with us. Subscribe, ring the bell, and step deeper into the shadows. We have many more legends waiting to be unearthed. Tell me, would you dare sit at that table?